Chapter 10. But what about the children? It is useful to think of life as a video game, having more than 1 billion levels of play. These are not two-dimensional levels, but three-dimensional layers, like an onion. Each layer approaches ever closer to an inward centeredness. Understanding each layer is difficult, but after mastering a layer, it becomes child's play to repeat it. In children, learning occurs very rapidly, as if pre-programmed, or simply verifying what has been learned previously. The child's mind experiences this evolutionary review all the way to adulthood. With adulthood, the layer of play is new and unfamiliar, more challenging, and mastered only with the expenditure of increased time and effort. Reason and emotions are functions of the mind, but are they different in adults and children? Consciology contends that the child's ability to reason emerges fully functional. Though its storehouse of raw data and processed data is minimal, the child is operating under no functional disability, only a lack of experience. We established that emotions arise both from the past and one's anticipation of the future. These include passions and desires from one's personal past, but the brainstem also carries humanity's instinctual past, the embryonic imprint of evolution. Though the child's desires from his personal past are presently accumulating, the most significant emotional past that a child experiences arises from the brainstem that carries humanity's instinctual past, the embryonic imprint of evolution. The imprint of evolution manifests itself both physically and mentally. Physically, during the prenatal phase, the human embryo retraces the millions of years of evolutionary development. It's all there for anyone who cares to observe it. From the one-celled amoeba, through the stages to mammals, then to the specifically human, and to this one unique individual. Somewhat later, the emotional function of the mind retraces its evolutionary past. With emotions, as with reason, the child's capacity arrives functionally mature, but devoid of personal emotional experiences. The child's emotions are capable of responding at a level far more complex than most adults are willing to acknowledge. Thus, in regard to functions of the mind, the child emerges fully functional, both in reason and emotion. Maturation involves integrating experiences, not a maturing of the mental functions. Adulthood is reached around age 21 and signifies physical and mental maturity. We know that maturity involves more than simply growing in stature. Prenatal growth culminates in birth, though the skull is not fully formed for more than a year. Sexual development commences a dozen years later. Mental and physical development progress until about age 21. Various aspects of society recognize adulthood from age 16 to age 21. Prior to the age of adulthood, the child is sheltered and is treated as being somewhat disabled. In fact, when the political government chooses to recognize children as adults prior to the legal age, it is said to be removing their disabilities. These legal disabilities prohibit the child's functioning in the adult world under the guise of protecting the child. This is the same guise that political governments use to prohibit adults from functioning in the adult world when it sees fit. We have tried to demonstrate that political government protection of adults living in an adult world hinders the adult's development and restricts one's chances of expanding one's awareness of consciousness. The searchers after authority propose that every solution is a government or a religious solution. Although the searchers after what is find neither of these solutions satisfactory, they do rely heavily upon the family group to exercise authority over children in that family. This authority of the family group has no jurisdiction over adults, only children, and only children in that family. Political governments tend to treat adults like children, and children as if there were no family group authority. This is done because political governments want to be everyone's authority, and because the family members ask, but what about the children? Let's investigate one example where human laws devised by political governments tend to treat adults and children differently. So-called mind-altering drugs include illegal drugs, prescription drugs, and over-the-counter drugs. Each category represents a different degree of government control over the individuals who use them. A degree of government control applies to the over-the-counter drugs. These include mind-altering drugs regulated by two different government agencies. The Food and Drug Administration controls drugs thought to be for medicinal purposes. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms controls the legal mind-altering drugs of alcohol and tobacco. Other government control of certain mind-altering drugs is assigned to government-licensed doctors that regulate access by way of prescriptions. The most government control is exerted over individuals who wish to partake of what the government has decreed are illegal mind-altering drugs. It will not be necessary to describe this category, as the government has been quite successful in publicizing it. If any entrepreneur were able to mount such a far-reaching campaign to call attention to its wares, it would no doubt become the leading gainer of the stock exchange. And of course, there are such entrepreneurs. They are not listed on any stock exchange because government denies their right to exist. But they nevertheless do exist and thrive on phenomenal profits, largely due to the efforts of political governments. From the fact that the local government policemen visit the government schools to educate the youth about the latest in mind-altering drugs, to the nightly news that covers the latest government interdiction of illicit drugs, to the tabloid recordings, television programs, and motion pictures that idealize the stars who partake of these apparent awards of fame, to the lyrics and plots that sensationalize the powers of mind-altering drugs. The success of these campaigns to heighten drug awareness is unmistakable. It matters not that a lot of the attention is negative. It keeps the matter of mind-altering drugs uppermost in the public consciousness, and a portion of the idle minds are mesmerized by its siren call. The degree varies, but they are all mind-altering drugs, whether cigarettes, beer, wine, liquor, Valium, marijuana, or heroin. Apart from the unprecedented publicity campaign, what is the attraction of mind-altering drugs? Obviously, to alter the mind from its present condition. Then maybe Consciology and mind-altering drugs share the same goal. Don't mind-altering drugs expand one's awareness of consciousness? No, mind-altering drugs do not expand one's awareness of consciousness. Mind-altering drugs appear to alter the mind. To be under the influence is to disconnect from the self. It is to surrender oneself to one's primal animal instincts and to relinquish responsibility for one's actions. It resembles the liberating feeling that the addict experiences after hitting bottom, facing one's demons and declaring that one's future development stems solely from one's own understanding. Having discovered the floor of one's emotions, one's future emotions can only soar upward. One need never suffer this emotional death again. It is the beginning of one's taking responsibility for one's own actions. It is a rebirth, another chance, a new future. The under the influence feeling gives a false hint of this liberating experience until the hangover exposes the experience as just a dream. Nothing has changed. From a feeling of the ecstasy of liberation, one has been slammed back to the actual. One seeks to escape oneself, but only succeeds in discovering a hangover. After having glimpsed, under the influence, how liberation might feel, finding oneself in one's old predicament and an added hangover leaves one even worse than before. Temperance in all things, including this one, means that temperance is always desirable in general. But life does not occur in general. Life occurs in specifics. While human beings remain limited, incomplete, and imperfect, their responses to specific situations will on occasion demand intemperance. No, this is not to say that intemperance ever is a proper response in general. It is simply to admit that limited, incomplete, and imperfect human beings misrepresent misinterpret life's conditions. One should always proceed forward, but having encountered a brick wall, one can only retreat, reassess, and start over in a new direction. If the area near the brick wall is awash in quicksand, temperance is not advisable. Immediate, decisive, and intemperate action is required. Only to the extent that one's choices are valid and not limited, incomplete, and imperfect can temperance in all things really mean all things. A close inspection of the conditions under which fictional action heroes function reveals one hopeless situation after another. Yes, the action hero conquers every obstacle. But back up a few steps. Where do all these hopeless situations come from? The mighty forces of evil are forever plotting impending catastrophes that the action hero must set right. But Consciology tells us that these mighty forces of evil are in reality our own collective proclivity for addictive behavior. And it is we who must become the action hero bent on conquering our own addictions. To the extent that one is able to master one's addictive tendencies, fewer intemperate actions are required. Not so with the action hero. Insurmountable problems continue without end. The action motion pictures remain a staple genre for adults, just as they dominate the television cartoons that children absorb. The violence has already been addressed. Here we wish only to confront the action mode. To praise this form of entertainment is to glorify intemperance. Some justify it as innocuous escapism, a fantasy to relax one after having been subjected to a day too full of reality. One might believe this excuse if these were merely diversions. But these are the movies that get checked out time after time in the video stores. They are the majority kids' fare on television. Action fantasies are actually how children are taught the victim mentality. They are not responsible for what happens to them. Someone else will rescue them. What child could dare to think otherwise after constantly being confronted by the unbridled ferocity of these imagined forces of evil? What possible value could temperance be in challenging a world inhabited by these action heroes and their evil adversaries? Even when in adulthood, some recognize that it is they who are responsible for becoming the action hero, they still flock to the adult action motion picture to justify a reluctance to assume their role. The action picture presents life as mission impossible. How could human beings be expected to take responsibility for seeking such an apparently unattainable goal? It seems obvious that these super action heroes we are not. Like the supposed actions of the devil, the arch rivals of these super action heroes are crafted to justify one's doubts of one's own self-worthiness for this task. Children and adults alike are conditioned by these fantasies to deny the search after what is and cling to the search after an authority to protect us. If we are ever to comprehend the value of temperance, the universality of innocence of children and adults must first be affirmed. What is not a function of age. What is for children and adults. To presume a separation where none exists is to create an imaginary barrier to respecting innocence in both children and adults. Regardless of age, we are all innocent of what we do not yet understand. Regardless of age, only by replacing intemperate responses with temperate ones can the well-being of humanity increase. Violent, intemperate actions appear to limited, incomplete, and imperfect human beings as necessary responses to what the world deals us. As one learns to interpret one's view of the world with greater precision, one discovers that temperance, rightly interpreted, precludes circumstances ever developing that seem to require responses fraught with intemperate actions. So-called mind-altering drugs only appear to be mind-altering drugs. The most they can deliver is a tease that expanding one's awareness of consciousness is possible. they cannot deliver on that promise. They can only provide an appearance of progress, followed by a hangover in one form or another, and eventual harm to one's health. The search after authority is like searching for mind-altering drugs. The drugs exist, and the authorities exist, but neither can deliver what it promises. Expanding one's awareness of consciousness begins within and may then extend outward. The outward thrust can give heart to those who are about to make the discovery on their own. But the discovery of how one can expand one's awareness of consciousness is an internal, individual, and intensely personal revelation. The only purpose that the so-called mind-altering drugs can serve is as negative examples. They illustrate how deceptive things can be to those who are not sufficiently focused upon the goal of truly expanding one's awareness of consciousness by means that achieve lasting results, and that a more focused inner consciousness is possible. Political governments declare that some so-called mind-altering drugs are illegal. Others it declares to be Political governments declare that some mind-altering drugs are declared to be legal. Others it declares to be illegal. Since all can be harmful to health, there are those who whine regarding the legal ones. But what about the children? Well, what about the children? The main concern about the children is that they are innocent children who need to be protected. Is it possible that age-driven laws create an atmosphere among youth, the negative consequences of which cannot be overcome, even upon attaining adulthood? Does anything really occur at a particular age that changes so-called mind-altering drugs from bad to good, from illegal to legal, and from harmful to not harmful? Your response may be, of course not, but children must be protected because their inexperience renders them overly vulnerable to these dangers that can easily overwhelm the innocent. Yes, but focus on alcoholic consumption by minors. Physically, nothing occurs on reaching the adult age that makes the alcoholic consumption any less physically damaging to those who consume it. They are no less likely to become drunk and disorderly, and if experience can be trusted, the likelihood that the young adult will exercise adult judgment regarding moderate consumption does not appear to be in evidence. On the contrary, the consumption of alcohol has become a rite of passage, almost a societal reward for achieving adulthood. Our supposed goal of protecting the child from alcohol has created a monster whereby the child sees the consumption of alcohol as a reward for graduating from the hardships of childhood. Imprisonment leads the inmate to feel that release from prison is an opportunity to get even with society for what it has made one suffer while in prison. Similarly, the new adult seems to perceive all of the inequities of childhood as being cleansed by the government's law that grants absolution with the once forbidden alcohol. To those who perceive their childhoods as having been less than they deserved, alcohol can be expected to trap them into addiction. To those perceiving their childhoods as normal, alcohol can be expected to provide an excuse to escape the problems that living presents. It would appear that saving the child from the ravages of excess alcoholic consumption only delays and magnifies the negative consequences. No one wants to endure the sight of a drunken child. But is there really any reason that our horror should be a factor of age? If one's perceived inequities in childhood can result in adult overindulgence, could not the problem be better addressed at the time the offending condition occurs? Maybe society simply does not wish to face the problem. By delaying the consumption of alcohol until adulthood, perhaps the problem will go away and society will not have to be bothered. After years of denying that a problem exists, the emotional suppression may have become so acute that the result of the individual's acting out behaviors escalate from addiction to imprisonment. Actually, there is much evidence to suggest that in spite of the child's innocence and inexperience, that the problem would be more efficiently resolved in a family group setting than delaying its confrontation to an age when errors result in incarceration instead of a family group solution. Children, like the young adult, possess vital bodies that are better able to function under adverse conditions than are those of more advanced years. Oftentimes the only reason the drunk gives up drinking is that it has become evident that one's body can no longer endure the abuse. When the searchers after authority assemble to decide what they cannot trust their fellow human beings to decide for themselves, the use of so-called mind-altering drugs is a major topic. As we have already covered, they are put in categories to be prescribed only by government licensed doctors, are made available to the public at large, are licensed for consumption only under certain conditions, or forbidden entirely. It is at this point that a lament from the back of the room emerges. But what about the children? And a whole new set of stipulations is added. We have already established that it is the position of Consciology that children are born fully grown, emotionally and rationally. They only lack experiences, current data on which to adapt their reason and emotions. If one is to accept this, legal prohibitions designating minors as either above the law or below the law are totally without merit and are demeaning to children. The child's family is charged with protecting the child from those who would take advantage of one's inexperience. To attempt to transfer this responsibility to government by legal maneuvers gives the appearance of an easy solution. But as with any oversimplification, the apparent solution simply substitutes new problems. In human law, children and adults are recognized as being basically different. In fact, they are not. That the child has limited experience also describes the adult. It is this artificial separation that not only misrepresents the rights of children, but distorts the rights of adults as well. Assume no legal difference between the rights of children and adults. Then regarding so-called mind-altering drugs, it becomes necessary to face the real issue. Consider alcoholic consumption alone. Either the consumption of alcohol is to be legal for adults and children, or it is to be illegal for adults and children. Legal prohibition proved to most that the illegality of consuming alcohol is not an option. Alcoholic consumption again became legal after the Prohibition experiment, but the prohibitionists sought to save face by holding for prohibition regarding children. Since children have no legal standing and do not vote, few had any real objection to this maneuver. Certainly, neither constituency wishes to encourage drinking among children. But the fact is that child prohibition does encourage a desire among children to drink, just as alcoholic prohibition, adult prohibition, did during the Noble experiment. 4 major events occur when a child graduates to adulthood. The new adult can vote, serve in the military, drive a car, and drink alcohol. Generally, neither voting nor service in the military are greeted with much enthusiasm. But the allure of both driving and drinking have teased them for a number of years, to the extent that the pent-up passions have grown to critical mass. Without a law that prohibited children from drinking, families would for the most part take control. But there would be exceptions where the public would suffer the sight of pitiable children under the influence of demon rum, and legal solutions would be absent. Hopefully, charitable organizations would be in evidence, but just assume they were not. Regardless of the impact of this emotionally devastating sight, would society, on balance, be better off or worse off? Since this is about children, let's observe it from the child's point of view. The drinking of alcohol would no longer appear as a reward for coming of age. However, some would view it much the same to escape the control of the family. But what a difference! To reach the legal drinking age while still under the sway of the family is to receive a right with no accompanying responsibility. to be released from the family authority, thereby presenting one with the option to drink, offers the privilege and at the same time the responsibility. Any adverse consequences of drinking would fall on the shoulders of the newly liberated adult and would no longer be the legal burden of the family. Children growing up would be privileged to observe the results that accrue to those older who choose to consume or abstain from the consumption of alcohol, and the impact of those decisions on their lives. Have you ever noticed how well poor motion pictures fare when introduced with much hype and simultaneous openings in thousands of theaters across the nation? Similar shows, presented in a few theaters at a time, fare worse when potential patrons are able to consider the judgments of other moviegoers before making their decision as to whether they will attend. It is not conducive to an informed decision to assume that the decision has to be made according to a strict timetable. If a child regards one's childhood experiences as being unjust in some regard, it is natural that this child will hold unreasonably high expectations on the legal bestowing of adulthood. If the responsibilities of adulthood do not coincide with this legal event, these unreasonable expectations present opportunities without responsibility. Such artificial conditions effectively restrict one's potential to increase one's awareness of consciousness. The abolition of the concept of childhood as a legal disability would simply coincide with the facts affirming that there is no difference between the capacity for reasoning and emotions between children and adults. This affirmation of fact would appear to benefit both children during childhood and when they advance into adulthood, having escaped the disabled label. The use of alcohol and cigarettes is not a matter decided by whether age renders an individual disabled and thus subject to being a ward of the state. Child or adult, this is a matter of education as to the pros and cons of using alcohol and cigarettes. Adults are deemed capable of making this decision without reference to the state. Children's decisions regarding the use of alcohol and cigarettes should be subject only to the decision of their parents, as in all other matters regarding the family. What applies to the use of alcohol and cigarettes, of course in logic, applies equally to all so-called mind-altering drugs. Certainly, putting some on a prescription basis would seem to be prudent. This would help to assure that the individual is adequately educated as to the dangers involved in their use. The present system of attributing an arbitrary disability to childhood simply provides these vices with an allure that leaves few young adults capable of resisting their seduction. Denying mind-altering drugs to children is begging the question. The question is not whether children should use mind-altering drugs. The question is whether human beings should use mind-altering drugs. by passing a human law that prohibits children from using mind-altering drugs before a certain age, the society gives tacit approval to their use by adults and multiplies the fascination they hold for children. If, as we are saying, these children have equal powers of reason and emotion to those of adults, the child recognizes that spectator sports and mass musical events are as much opportunities to partake of mind-altering drugs as to witness the performances. Looking to adults for guidance in matters where the child's experiences are inadequate, the child can only deduce that the reason the child's perception of these spectator events borders on boredom is that the principal joys are as opportunities to celebrate the joys of alcohol, other drugs, and cigarettes. Thus, these events lead the child to conclude that one will understand these joys when one reaches adulthood and is free to share in these adult joys. No, we do not want governments to treat adults as children and restrict the access of adults to using alcohol and cigarettes. Yes, we do want individuals to be free to decide for themselves whether to use these mind-altering drugs. But by legally reserving alcohol and cigarettes for the exclusive enjoyment, in quotes, of adults, are we not setting the child up to perceive false benefits from mind-altering drugs? And aren't we implanting this perception so firmly in the child's psyche that when the child inevitably asks, "Is this all there is?" one is drawn deeper into mind-altering drugs of ever-increasing danger? Does the firm conviction, reinforced through a decade of childhood training, lead one to be driven to experiment with more and more debilitating drugs, both legal and illegal, as a result of impossible expectations held by the child and fostered by the deceptions perpetrated by adults? But what about the children? Exactly. Children learn by modeling adults. If the adults are searchers after authority, they are on a quest that is doomed to failure. The result is adults who are frustrated and depressed, and children who are deceived. Children perceive that the laws the authorities administer reward the attainment of their majority years by permitting them to share in the adult joy, in quotes, of using mind-altering drugs. But the issue is not one of years, but one of fact. The mind of the individual is either benefited reasonably and emotionally by the use of mind-altering drugs, or it is not. Age is not a factor. To equate benefits according to age is to deceive children and adults alike. If, but what about the children, expresses our genuine concern, then the proper question is, what about this deception that makes age the major barrier to a practice that harms adults and children alike? Raising the question but what about the children? Is about protecting their innocence. Protecting the innocence of children is admirable. To introduce factors into their innocent calculations with which they are not yet equipped to deal creates the problem. But there is yet one more question on this subject that needs to be addressed. Does all innocence reside in children? Or stated another way, should the protection of innocence end at some arbitrary age of adulthood? If we can agree that innocence should be protected, then why should such protection be directed at the innocent child to the exclusion of the innocent adult? We depreciate the loss of childhood innocence by lauding the child who is street smart. We ridicule the continuation of innocence into adulthood with such pejoratives as rube, country bumpkin, mama's boy, daddy's little girl, as well as other more vicious references. The degree of viciousness contained in the terms measures the degree of the pain that one's own loss of innocence has extracted. It is the maintenance of innocence into so-called adulthood that enables a select few to create masterworks in music, art, philosophy, psychology, economics, and ethics. A certain innocence in some areas of learning is necessary to maintain the degree of focus that is required for acts of creation. A certain innocence is requisite to extending the leading edge of expanding one's awareness of consciousness. The question is not a philosophical one. Innocence is to be protected. The question is an economic one. How is innocence best protected? Innocence is not best protected by human laws that arbitrarily affix disabilities on those under a certain age and then remove them after the designated age has been attained. The how of maintaining innocence is an economic question. It is not accomplished by outside edict, but by self-disciplined individuals, often operating within the family structure. Prime examples of the futility of attempting to protect innocence by human laws drafted to protect the children is to be found in the distribution channels of the motion picture industry and the development of the internet. Motion pictures were initially shown almost exclusively in motion picture theaters. There were family motion pictures and there were pornographic motion pictures. The motion pictures were shown in the motion picture theaters on Upper Main Street. The pornographic motion pictures were shown in motion picture theaters along Lower Main Street or at stag parties. No doubt some people attended both, but there was no doubt that one was generally accepted while the other was generally shunned. It was also a fact that over 90% of the population attended the family motion picture theaters from time to time, and that less than 10% would ever think of venturing into the pornographic motion picture theater. There are those who would agree with these estimates, while strongly contending that many in the 90% would wish to view the pornographic motion pictures, but were thwarted by the rundown condition of the theaters, venturing into that neighborhood, chancing that someone might see them entering or leaving the theater, associating with the type of people who frequented the place, and so forth. Then came cable television, and Upper Main Street and Lower Main Street were consolidated into the same cable box. At first, there were choices to be made. If you chose family motion pictures, you chose to subscribe to that channel, and if you chose pornographic motion pictures, you chose to subscribe to another channel. This presented no problem. You paid your money and you took your choice. It was the rating system that took away the choices. Yes, it was the broadening of the choices that removed the choices. It was the democratization of moving pictures that abolished the freedom to choose what motion pictures one would view. In past chapters, we have discussed in detail how evil exists only in the minds of those who fear it and want others to fear it, mainly in the minds of searchers after authority. To the searcher after what is, there is only what is. What is not, is not. To put this in behavioral terms, the positive represents acceptable behavior. The negative represents unacceptable behavior. Again, in behavioral terms, does a family decide to permit the children to function 90% of the time in an acceptable mode and 10% in an unacceptable mode? No. If the authority of the family is to be maintained, its position must be 100% in favor of acceptable behavior. Is this possible? Of course not. Families are composed of human beings who are incomplete, limited, and imperfect. Human beings are not capable of understanding absolutes, let alone behaving in absolute terms. Nevertheless, the goal must always be 100%. Human shortcomings must be recognized and compensated for. But evil is not one of these. In a game of darts, depending upon speed and distance, a dart can be expected to land a constant distance below the aimed for point due to gravity. If that deficit is 2 inches, the accomplished dart competitor will adjust the speed and or distance of the throw to compensate for this 2-inch downward drift. For assuming the same speed and distance, the dart thrower simply aims at a point 2 inches above the desired destination. Recognizing our humanity and our lack of understanding of absolutes, we simply aim higher than we can be expected to achieve. Because we are human beings, we think of concepts as being poles apart, and a spectrum defines all the gradations in between. But right and wrong are not poles apart with a spectrum separating the gradations between them. Right is what is. Wrong is what is not. What is not is not. No pole, no spectrum, nothing. Evil, or misinformation, or error, or false data cannot be numbered among these aspects of the physical world for which human beings must compensate. On the contrary, human beings are not to compensate for these errors of judgment, precisely because they do not occupy either space or time and have no evidence in the physical world nor in the mental world. To acknowledge a spectrum of rating motion pictures in gradations of good and evil is to empower evil. Yes, there will always be those who would empower evil. That is bearable. They represent no threat. It is when those who would hope to empower good provide legitimacy for the evil that evil appears to become a threat. Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged identified the sanction of the victim. That occurs when those who would empower good mistakenly empower evil. And by sanctioning the evil, the good render themselves its victim. Evil does nothing. The error of the good intentioned brings about their victimization by their own error in judgment. The ratings of motion pictures are based upon age groupings, as if an individual who has been functioning for a certain number of years is fair game for any unspeakable debauchery. In fact, freedom of choice certainly allows a choice for debauchery, but no less freedom of choice allows a choice against debauchery. For a time, the rating system of motion pictures seemed only to maintain a freedom of choice to choose debauchery. But competition for cable viewers among competing channels increasingly combined debauchery with family viewing to the point where the freedom of choice was eliminated. That is, a choice to abstain from the viewing of debauchery was denied to anyone who chose to view motion pictures in one's home through a cable connection. Some still will contend that the freedom of choice remains. The individual is free to change channels or to turn the set off. But that is only marginally factual. The choice occurs only after the offending debauchery has been viewed. When one hunts among the available channels, those showing questionable fare are not blocked by a screen that announces that questionable material is being displayed so that the viewer might either choose to stay and watch or continue to hunt for a desirable program. If the individual misses the 10-second disclaimer at the beginning of the show, no further warning is offered. It is up to the hapless viewer to watch long enough to make the determination for oneself after the fact of having viewed a sampling of the debaucherous material. The rating system for motion pictures claims to act in behalf of protecting the innocence of youth. To a degree, this may be accomplished in a theater setting, but not when the same motion pictures are cabled into one's home. It is the contention of Consciology that all human beings are potential addicts. But each individual is unique. The threat of becoming victim to each addiction varies among individuals. One falls prey to one addiction, while another individual is not drawn to it at all, but is attracted by yet another addiction. It is imperative that the individual be left free enough to choose one's addiction. That is, one must be free to focus one's efforts on conquering the individual's addiction of choice without being forced to confront an array of addictions simultaneously. Addictions are mental diseases. In the physical world, human beings are subject to physical diseases. The human being is protected from these physical diseases by one's immune system. But the immune system has limits. It can fight off an attack of measles, then an attack of mumps, then an attack of strep throat, then an attack of pneumonia. But it may not be capable of fighting off all of these diseases at once. To afflict an individual with exposure to multiple debaucheries may very well require the expenditure of a degree of mental immunity beyond the capability of the individual to provide. Evidence that human beings acknowledge these limitations can be found in the fact that human laws limit prostitution to certain counties in Nevada, and until comparatively recently, limited gambling to comparatively few geographical areas. It was an acknowledgement that human beings felt that they were fully occupied with defending against ever-present addictions without having also to grapple with these simultaneously. Not too long ago, many counties chose to prohibit the sale of liquor within their borders. Others prohibited mixed drinks. States prohibited gambling before they decided to become the gambling administrators and reap the bounties of bingo or lottery gambling themselves. Human laws that limit one's exposure to temptation simply express a collective need to limit their exposure to potential addictions, to preserve their innocence. Shouldn't innocence be respected regardless of age? The adoption of motion picture ratings has loosed the debauchery of Lower Main Street into every home served by cable television. Human beings are limited creatures, and their defenses against temptations can only stand so much. The human being who is tempted by the debauchery of Lower Main Street may be able to refrain from succumbing to its call to enter its territory, but may be powerless to resist it once it breaches the walls of one's home. While motion pictures depicting debauchery have entered the home through the cable television, even more crude expressions of debauchery have entered the home through the phone line modems connected to the internet. Here too, the innocence of children and adults alike is assaulted. The potential addict is molested by temptations often beyond one's ability to resist. Society hates the child molester. But society supports a system that spawns the molester. The molester, we recognize, may molest children, the elderly, men or women, starved for the affection of other men or women in any combination. Those who have what the molester wants are those who simply fall victim to the uncontrolled rage of the molester. How can we approve of a system that goads the potential victim of the addiction of molestation into giving full rein to that addictive behavior? It was the acceptance of the rating system of motion pictures that freed debauchery to gain entrance to homes through cable television. Such a rating spectrum uniting right and wrong is simply not possible. The two are unrelated. Without the ratings, the channels would remain separated, like Upper Main Street and Lower Main Street. The choice for debauchery or for the expansion of one's awareness of consciousness would endure. Such a separation of subscriber channels would bring about a similar division in internet offerings. A respect for innocence among children and adults would be maintained. The freedom to witness debauchery would remain, but the freedom to separate oneself from it would be reinstated. Innocence of children should be maintained. Innocence of any age should be respected. Why not respect the needs of all innocence, regardless of age?